BC, Canada, and the world face a climate emergency. In the coming decades, climate change is increasingly likely to cause significant global, economic, and social disruption alongside accelerating ecological degradation. In Canada, irreversible warming is occurring at twice the global rate. As we formulate our response to the climate emergency, we must recognize past injustice and ensure that justice is central to our approach. Today, we will be discussing the role of UBC and by extension, Canadian universities in relation to climate justice. My name is Tara Ivanochko. I'm the academic director of the UBC Sustainability Initiative. I will be hosting our conversation today. Joining me as co-moderator is Michelle Marcus. Michelle is a UBC Environmental Sciences undergraduate student, an organizer with Climate Justice UBC, and former co-chair of the UBC Climate Emergency Task Force. Michelle is currently organizing for divestment at the national level with the Divest Canada Coalition and Banking on a Better Future campaign. Welcome, Michelle.
Thanks for the introduction, Tara, and welcome everyone to this event. It's great to have you all here. I just want to take a moment now to acknowledge that this event is being hosted by UBC Vancouver, which is located on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam Nation. And as we are gathering on Zoom, you may all be situated on different Indigenous lands, so I want to acknowledge all of those lands as well. We cannot talk about climate justice without recognizing the ongoing structures of settler colonialism, which dispossess Indigenous peoples from their lands and propagate colonial oppression. Nor can we talk about climate justice without recognizing the movements for Indigenous rights and title and towards decolonization. This is fundamental to understanding and interrogating the causes, impacts, and solutions to the climate crisis. Indigenous peoples have been leading the fight against climate change and its root causes for generations, all while bearing the burden of climate destruction and resource extraction. And so UBC has a responsibility to Indigenous communities in general, as well as a particular obligation to the Musqueam and Okanagan nations on whose land it is situated. And so I look forward to discussing these responsibilities with our speakers today. On this note, I also want to extend my deep thanks to the Climate Emergency Indigenous Engagement Working Group for all their hard work integrating UNDRIP and Indigenous perspectives into the Climate Emergency Task Force report, and in doing so, making that report so much stronger and truer to the values of climate justice. And with that, I'll pass it back to Tara.
Thank you. So today we will hear from 4 individuals who are pushing UBC to internalize justice as part of our institutional response to the climate emergency. We will introduce our speakers individually as they join us. But first we will be hearing from Jessica Dempsey and Adriana Laurent. Each will speak for 10 minutes, followed by an opportunity for questions from Michelle and I and from the audience. We will then hear from Charles Menzies and Sharon Stein. Again, they will speak for 10 minutes each, followed by questions from the audience. If you have a question, please write it into the question and answer tab available to you at the bottom of your screen on your Zoom screen. So to begin, I am pleased to welcome Jessica Dempsey, who is an associate professor and associate head of undergraduate programs in the Department of Geography here at UBC. Jessica studies the political economy of extinction, and she is currently creating a new climate justice course that will be core to a new climate change certificate that will be offered here at UBC. Welcome, Jessica.
Thanks, Tara.
Great.
Hi, all.
We'll pass you the screen.
All right, great. Well, thanks to everybody, Tara, Michelle, the University Sustainability Initiative. I'm coming to you from East Vancouver on the unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh. And I wanted to start by acknowledging and appreciating the work that many Indigenous movements are doing right now and have for many years to curtail climate change. I'm thinking here of the tiny house warriors and the braided warriors who are really focusing on the TMX pipeline and all of the work that they're doing on the front lines. I also wanted to note some work that I've been reading in my class that I'm teaching right now, Geography 313. We've read the work of Navajo scholar Andrew Curley, who also really problematizes what we think of when we think of frontline communities, which is really a concept central to climate justice. And he really encourages us to make sure we're not kind of having a narrow view of the frontline Indigenous communities fighting fossil fuel pipeline and infrastructure in their territories, but also make sure to keep the sites of Indigenous communities who are very entangled in fossil fuel infrastructure, like the Navajo for Andrew Curley, who have a lot of coal mining, and so for whom transition or a just transition is not straightforward. So I just wanted to add that that's something that the students and me in this class I'm teaching really took a lot of insight from this term. So first, I want to say that I know so many people and groups at UBC advancing climate justice. There's the new AMS fund that's dedicated to the climate emergency. There's all the people, mostly students, former students around the Climate Hub. There's faculty members teaching crucial issues with students to move action forward. There's staff creating sustainability and climate initiatives, often on their own time and initiative. And there's, of course, all the students doing things inside and outside of the classroom. So I wanted to start my comments by also thanking all of those who are already doing this work of advancing climate justice as UBC, paid, and especially all of those doing it unpaid. So with that said, though, primarily my comments today are directed administration and governing bodies of UBC can do to advance and amplify and support and really grow the work that's already going on. Kind of inspired by David Letterman, I've made a top 10 list of things. I don't know how many people are familiar with David Letterman. When I thought about David Letterman, I had a ridiculous dive into his best top 10 lists. In any case, I've got a list of 10 things that I think UBC can do. I'm not convinced they're the top 10 by any means, but they're 10 things UBC can do to advance climate justice. So I'm just going to draw from those. Number one, the first thing UBC can do is it can finance and implement the Climate Emergency Task Force recommendations. So I spent some time yesterday rereading the task force recommendations. There's really ambitious and path-breaking stuff in that report. I encourage all of you to read it. It's been passed at the Board of Governors and the Senate, but who will implement and with what resources? We don't want UBC to be like decades of government institutions before who say, of course, climate change is happening and even it's an emergency, but then fail to take the requisite action, which usually means they fail to invest the financial resources into implementation. So a lot of what comes in the rest of my top 10 comes from the Climate Emergency Report, and I'm going to reference it wherever I can just to show how important that document is. So number two, the second thing UBC can do is it can divest from fossil fuels across all asset classes by 2025. This is word for word from the Climate Emergency recommendations, and it can reinvest 5% into community projects. If you're interested, this is page 13 of the Climate Emergency Report. Right now, UBC is saying it will divest from fossil fuels by 2030. I suggest, and many others, including the students at the Climate Justice UBC, say that they have to speed up this timeline in alignment with the climate emergency recommendations. UBC was one of the first universities to commit to divestment, but now it's behind others like Concordia, Guelph, UVic, all committed to divest by 2025, Lakehead by 2023. Okay, so that was point two. But divestment from fossil fuels is really only one part of what we could call kind of climate justice investing. And that takes us to point three. So point three on the climate of things that UBC can do to advance climate justice is lead in, quote, embedding climate justice values into investment screening. This is a quote directly from page 13 of this report. So what would this mean? I think Climate Justice UBC put it best in a letter to UBC in August of last year. They say it means along with a 1.5 degree pathway and consideration of the social aspects of climate impacts, including human rights, racial justice, Indigenous rights, and working conditions. So here we're talking about kind of moving in our financial decision making. UBC is a financial actor in addition to all of its other things that it does, to pushing beyond divestment from fossil fuels. And I have one concrete example of something UBC do. UBC could work with researchers like law professors, critical Indigenous studies professors, and financial managers to actually implement UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, into their financial and investment decision-making. And even concrete, I suggest that rather than porting the Sustainable Futures Pool into the main endowment fund, this is getting a bit technical, but I want to be really concrete. This was something that was suggested at the Finance Committee at the Board of Governors just last week or earlier this week. I suggest that UBC use their Sustainable Futures Pool to actually raise the bar further on and to create this justice investing lens to further advance human and racial justice criteria and screening in its investments. So that's point 3. Point 4 on this list, advance, quote, full disclosure of all investments across all asset classes. This is a recommendation on page 35, and publicly report on its progress towards divestment. So really excellent. UBC started to release its holdings, so it started to tell us all what it's investing in, but there's further work done, including releasing private equity just to catch up with what other institutions like SFU do. Why is this so important that there's this kind of transparency and disclosure? Well, those of us in the social sciences and beyond know that greenwashing is rampant. We also know that people inside the administration care deeply about advancing on these issues, but often face challenges. And so social change, needs insiders and outsiders pushing for change. So we want, the administration to let us help you by releasing more information on what you're doing so that people on the outside can also be effective advocates. So that's point 4. Point 5, quote, mandate that all UBC vendors, including but not limited to requests for proposals, properly align their products and services to bold climate justice standards. So this is on page 35 as well of the report. So why is this so important? Well, UBC is a huge consumer of goods and services, and each of those decisions has a ripple effect in the marketplace and also more broadly politically. So UBC can require all who they purchase from, both goods and services, to operate in relation to climate justice principles. Again, this is on climate emergency, page 35. So you need to create a kind of criteria, climate justice criteria, that then you force those who are purchasers at UBC to apply in relation to all of its procurement. Point 6, and here again, I'm quoting from the Climate Emergency Task Force report. As a globally leading academic institution with commitments aligning its internal activities and operations with climate justice, UNDRIP, 1.5 degrees, and a justice-based recovery from COVID, UBC needs to maintain a consistent external advocacy platform that advances justice-based climate action beyond campus. What this means is really that UBC needs to use its political clout to go out in the world to advocate for climate justice. There's lots of ways they could do this, encouraging other institutions to divest, but also pushing the government, provincial and federal, on climate issues. Point 7 of the top 10 things they can do. Investigate and act on UBC's entanglement with fossil fuel and extractive industry funding of university activities and amending fundraising policy in alignment with this. This is also something in the Climate Emergency Task Force, page 35. So this primarily means we need to find out how many researchers are relying on fossil fuel funded capital, and also means transparency on donations. This is really important because we need to also think about a just transition or a transition for researchers and the university itself off these unsustainable flows of funding. And I've just got 3 other points. I'll go through them quickly. Point 8, actively cultivate and support a social change-oriented institution. So here I'm thinking about the way that the university can really support students, staff, and faculty speaking out for climate justice, engaging in political advocacy. I encourage you to look up Michelle Marcuse's op-ed in the UBC from January. If there was a chat, I would put it right in the chat. I'll follow up later with the link. I think Michelle has done a really good job of really pushing the university on this issue. Here I could think about the importance of investing long-term in the Climate Hub, which is doing amazing work and really walking the talk on a kind of intersectional environmental climate justice politics. Point 9, I think they can do action is support innovative and social change-oriented climate justice education. So I'm working on something with Tara here, which we're creating a new certificate in climate change studies that students can take. But also here we can think about the importance of creating a context where faculty are encouraged to build path-breaking cross-disciplinary collaborations on the teaching side. And finally, point 10, again, here is a direct quote from the climate emergency report, which is, quote, complete an institution-wide study and publish a public report of the findings that identifies UBC's past and ongoing roles in contributing to climate change impacts that are disproportionately burdening marginalized communities, and commit to a suite of actions to pay this ecological debt. So here's this an invitation that's in the climate emergency task force that asks UBC to really attend to the kinds of historical responsibilities that it has for climate change and climate change related impacts. So there you are, my top 10. Happy to answer questions, and thank you all for having me.
Thank you, Jess. We will be taking questions after the first 2 speakers. So if you do have a question, please put it in the question and answer tab at the bottom, and we'll be able to pull from the questions from the audience in just a few minutes. Our second speaker is Adriana Laurent. She's a recent UBC graduate. She's co-founder and current project administrator of the UBC Climate Hub, and has been coordinating student projects that link students, faculty, and community under the umbrella of the Climate Justice Research Collaborative. So welcome, Adriana.
Hello, everyone. My name is Adriana, and I use she, her pronouns. And I wanted to start by saying thank you to the organizers and also the attendees for coming today. It's always so difficult to follow Jess. Jess was my professor when I was in my undergrad, and it's an honor to be on a panel with her. And it's always so hard to follow her. But I wanted to start by also acknowledging that I'm joining you all from the stolen lands of the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh peoples. I really want to encourage folks, no matter where you are, to support the advocacy of local Indigenous communities and support their calls to action. And I really want to highlight the incredible youth-led group Braided Warriors, which I know Jess already highlighted, but I just wanted to really emphasize that. And before I start with my kind of recommendations for UBC, I did want to mention that my understanding of climate justice is grounded in my own experiences growing up in Central America and having felt the impacts of climate change already. It's really clear to me that we won't be able to work towards a climate just world if we aren't talking about Indigenous sovereignty and Black liberation, including in the Global South. And as we know, in January 2021, the task force submitted their final recommendations after the climate emergency declaration in 2020. I won't go into detail about the whole 175-page report, but I do want to share some stories about how we got there and the kind of support that is needed to continue this necessary work. I really want to highlight the role that youth leadership played and the ambition that they had in developing this report. And getting UBC to declare a climate emergency in the first place, and for their years of advocacy on climate justice and divestment. As we've seen all over the world, the youth climate movement has really pushed us all to do better and to better understand climate change as a systemic issue that is inextricably linked to social justice issues. The youth movement has also mobilized us on a scale we have not seen before on climate issues, and UBC is no exception to this. Youth and students played a key role in this work, starting from years of campaigning and advocacy to an open letter asking UBC to declare a climate emergency to being key advocates on the task force. Youth have continuously pushed UBC, Vancouver, Canada, and the whole world to be bold, brave, and ambitious in our work to address climate change. It's thanks to students and youth who advocated for years that we have these commitments on divestment. And a large part of the reason why we have the Climate Emergency Declaration. And I'm not saying that staff and faculty didn't have a role to play. I think they had a really important role. But the key to me is the momentum and the advocacy that we needed to get here came from students. And as an academic institution, I firmly believe that we have a responsibility to support what's in the best interest of students and in the best interest of their future. And we should be accountable to them as we plan for the future and as we plan for the future of the institution as well. If we want to continue the momentum to address climate change as the emergency that it is, we really need to support and generously fund youth climate initiatives, including but not limited to the Climate Hub. Shameless plug there. Our future and future generations are truly at stake here. We need to have a central place in creating the change that we so desperately need to have a livable planet. And I think the harsh reality of climate change is also having a massive impact on the mental health of young people, including at UBC, and having to go through your classes while thinking about the uncertainty and anxiety of climate change, all during a global pandemic, is incredibly difficult. And we know that action and community mobilizing is necessary to create the kind of resilient social networks that we need to not just address climate change, but support youth in their ability to cope with the uncertainty of the future we have. So how do we prepare youth for an increasingly uncertain future? What is UBC's role in shaping this future and the future of work and careers in a climate crisis? What kind of skills do youth need to learn? And what kind of knowledge do we need to learn to really start thinking about these issues? The work that was undertaken for the report would not have been possible without the incredible leadership of folks from the Indigenous Engagement Working Group. After months of asking for support to center the experiences and knowledge of Indigenous voices in the report, there was time dedicated and set aside to support the work of the Indigenous Engagement Working Group. This led to the UNDRIP analysis of the report, which was led by Dr. Sharon Stein. So I'll let her take that because she's speaking today as well. But the work of the Indigenous Engagement Working Group was so necessary and so important for this report. And there really needs to be a standing, ongoing Indigenous committee that is well-resourced, that is supported, and that has decision-making power for future climate plans and policies. And I think another point to me is that understanding climate justice requires us to be critical of our world and the systems we have in place. It also requires us to be critical of our own institutions and the role we have in upholding them. I don't think we can address climate issues by remaining neutral. Climate change is truly a matter of life and death for so many people already. It's already displaced thousands of people, disproportionately impacting Black and Indigenous folks, people of marginalized genders, future generations, disabled people, and low-income folks, and so many others. We need to be able to unpack our institutional complicity and responsibility in a way that accounts for past harms and moves forward with accountability and reparations, and ideally with a commitment to non-repetition. So that's really honestly just echoing what Jess had said before, but I firmly believe that as well. And if we were to take a closer look at the recommendations in the report, there are a couple that stand out to me as exciting opportunities to address climate justice at UBC. Operationalizing UBC's commitment to climate justice would look like supporting the work of racialized students and staff and faculty who are working on these issues, including the ones who are critical of the institution. We need to be clear around connecting the calls to action on climate justice with those laid out by the Inclusion Action Plan, as well as the Indigenous Strategic Plan. This work will also require us to value lived experience as important. You should not have to have a PhD in climate science in order to be taken seriously when you talk about climate justice, especially as racialized youth. We need to center the perspectives of people who are directly impacted by climate change. And one thing that really stands out to me is, given that UBC Vancouver is located on the stolen lands of the Musqueam people, our work related to climate justice should really be done in partnership with them. That shouldn't be something that gets set aside for future work. It really needs to be something that we're thinking about constantly. And there's also a point in the report that calls for the creation of climate justice standards or some kind of framework for UBC to work on that would include internal operations as well as external affairs. And I think that the standards or this framework should be grounded in UNDRIP as well. And we have a basis to start with this already because of the work of Dr. Sharon Stein. This is so important to consider when we're also thinking about the role of partnerships and advocacy for the institution. We need to critically question the ways that the fossil fuel industry and the mining industry have influence over our institutions. Do these partnerships really reflect our commitment to climate justice? Do they reflect the importance of Indigenous sovereignty? I really, really believe that the partnerships that we have and the ways that we receive funding and support need to reflect the values and the commitments we've made to social justice and climate justice. And I don't think they're at that point right now. UBC also has a crucial role to play when it comes to mobilizing knowledge on climate justice. We can't maintain the ivory tower. Our work needs to be shared with others, and we need to work with others, other universities, communities, municipalities, and governments to address the global nature of the global nature of climate change. And we cannot forget the role of advocacy in this work. Again, we cannot remain neutral. There's so much more to say about what could be done at UBC and beyond, but I do want to leave folks with the understanding that addressing climate change will require difficult conversations. It will require accountability, generous resourcing and funding, and a critical reflection of our own complicity. And this won't be easy to address. Our work moving forward has to center youth, and it has to center the experiences of people directly impacted by climate change, particularly Indigenous people, while also understanding that they are not a monolith. Our partnerships, financing, and the way we think about preparing youth for an uncertain future need to be at the forefront of the way that we plan for the institution. So thank you so much. I'm happy to take questions when the time is right for that.
Great, thanks, Adriana. Actually, Adriana, I'll ask you to stay here with us, and I'll invite Jess to join us again. And Michelle is here. So we just have a small opportunity now, both to follow up on some of the conversations, maybe between the things that you were saying. There was many overlaps, and we can dig in a little bit there, and we can also see some of the questions that are coming up from the audience. So there was two things that were resonating with me as you were speaking. One is the importance of the work that was done already through the huge process that happened to generate the recommendations that you're referring to. So in that sense, that has already reflected input from thousands of people, through community, through the faculties, and through students, and other ways to consolidate down into that. But as we start to make that happen, where do you see, or how do you see the places? So, is it just a matter of finding funding for these and the administration giving a budget to some of the line items, or is there something more systemic within the university that needs to change to allow these to happen? I would throw that either to Jess or to Adriana.
Adriana, do you want to weigh in? Does anything come to mind immediately for you?
I'm happy for you to go first on this one.
Okay. I mean, I think this is one of the real, I wouldn't want to be accusing anyone of anything at this point, because the climate emergency report did just pass through Senate. So I think there's still ample room and time for an adequate resourcing of many of these decisions. But I was really struck last night when I was rereading the task force report of just how much thought went into it and how much is already laid out. And I was really wondering, well, how is all of this going to be implemented? And so I think it's a real question, both of financing, but clearly many of these recommendations are not only about financing, right? I mean, many of them, like for example, some of the ones that I mentioned are about UBC becoming an advocate on these questions. So taking what Adriana said really seriously, I mean, some of the ideas, what would it look like for UBC, to think through building back better, climate justice together. Like what we need is a real effort to build maybe a climate justice core, right? Where you're starting to invest massively in employing students to do this necessary work of transition and to kind of really get out from underneath an austerity kind of way of thinking. Certainly we need to be thinking about the kind of stressors that face our students right now that can't be solved just by the institution itself, but the institution needs to do this work of being an advocate for our students. You know, we can't just raise tuition, even though I know that they're in a bind in many ways, but they need to become an advocate with the upper level. So I think some of it's budgetary, and then I think other parts of it are kind of these questions of becoming an advocate, having difficult conversations amongst different departments, starting to answer some of the questions in the report, which is like, how much do researchers at UBC receive funding from these industries, and then really kind of digging into to making good on these recommendations. So that's, I'll leave it at that. But Adriana, you probably have much more to say too.
Yeah, and I mean, I would definitely agree that obviously a large part of this would be how we resource it and how we fund it. And I think that's a crucial part of the conversation. And again, I'll emphasize what I said in my presentation, that I think the funding should really be allocated to folks who've been doing this work for years, in many ways unpaid. If you're thinking about youth advocates, but also for folks who have been talking about these issues for years and who are impacted by this. I think there's definitely a need for funding in that way. But also to echo what Jess had said, there's some things that don't require funding that could take, that could be acted upon now. There's things that could be worked on now. Whether I'm thinking about, for example, the idea of building this framework that I had mentioned that is actually in the report as well. Obviously, that's something that might require funding in the future, but to start developing it now, we have an understanding of what that could look like. We kind of know what we need to do to start working on this. And that doesn't require funding. I think another key piece to me that is important when we're talking about funding and kind of our next steps forward is accountability. I know that in a lot of ways we can make fancy statements and have a lot of really nice words on a website, but I think there also needs to be accountability as to what we're doing to move forward, to actually start addressing the calls to action in a way that's honest and in a way that's really transparent. And I think that's something that was also brought up by Jess, but I think there's a lot of work to be done on that, because I think we really need to take the climate crisis seriously. And again, I don't think we can have a neutral stance on this. I don't think that we are able to declare a climate emergency and then still continue to receive money from fossil fuel industry. That to me is very much similar to what happened on a federal level when they declared a climate emergency and then passed TMX the next day. Like these things, we need to be really, really critical about ourselves with that. And obviously funding is a component, but I think in order to be able to adequately fund and resource these actions, we need to start having these difficult conversations, and we need to start building these mechanisms of accountability to begin with. And then the last thing that I just wanted to touch on is that a core part that I think is really important when we're talking about climate justice is relationship building and who we're partnering with, who we are investing our time. So it's not necessarily, a funding question at the moment, but who we're investing our time with, which I think is a huge component too. And that doesn't always require funding either. So there's lots to say about funding, but there's also so much that can be done now that doesn't require that. But I think it's important to have kind of that green light from the institution to move ahead on these issues, so that staff, faculty, and students also know that there's an opportunity here to mobilize on that.
Thanks for those great answers. I think, to me, this accountability piece is really huge. And it kind of comes down to a question of what are the university's priorities and how are those priorities decided? And I think that relates a lot to what you're saying about, who needs to be included in this process, and how do processes around how the university makes decisions need to change. And I think that maybe that's something that we'll want to revisit at the end when we bring in the other panelists, because I think they'll also have things to add to that. But for now, I want to turn to an interesting question that was raised in the Q&A, which it really relates to the points that I heard from you about who the university is partnering with. And I think that oftentimes there's a lot of interest in building new partnerships to address the climate emergency, but the question of which partnerships we need to end gets less attention, and it's a much more difficult conversation. As you're talking about, Adriana, this is not going to be easy. And so there's a question in the from the audience about how UBC is still training students to work for the oil and gas and mining industry. And so that's like one example of that continuing relationship with these industries. And so I'm curious, if you could speak a little bit more to like how UBC can actually like implement a just transition in its research and teaching, and how we might need to address like phasing out some of those partnerships.
Tough question, but super, super important. And I think, like, to me, but before I jump in with, I guess, my answer to that, I do just want to highlight the fact that the fossil fuel industry knew about climate change decades ago and chose to spend millions of dollars in lobbying against action on climate change, as opposed to starting the conversation around transitioning. So I think there's a huge amount of work that needs to be done to repair the damage that they have caused, and the responsibility that fossil fuel industry has in accelerating the climate crisis. But that's a larger conversation there. But I think definitely UBC needs to seriously reflect on their relationships. I think there's a bit of a hypocrisy there. Like I said, if we're declaring climate emergency and we're trying to uphold Indigenous sovereignty, how are we having relationships with fossil fuel industry? I think that's something that to me seems very hypocritical. And obviously these are going to be difficult conversations, especially if we're thinking about how there's a lot of folks who are working towards degrees in the fossil fuel industry. But I think that there's also a bit of an issue around how we're framing the just transition, because in many ways, the people who are going to be impacted by the transition away from fossil fuels, if we don't do it in a way that's just, are the workers. And I think that really needs to be at the center of the conversation too. Like we really need to start talking about how folks who are currently working in these industries are going to be impacted, and also thinking about how a lot of the work that has been lost has also been lost due to technology, as opposed to transitioning away from the fossil fuel industry, which is something that doesn't get talked about a lot. And I think that's something important to highlight when for transparency as well. So anyway, to actually answer your question, I feel like I went on a bit of a ramble there. I definitely think that UBC needs to start considering the way that they're partnering with the fossil fuel industry and backing away from that, and having, I think an important part of doing that is having some kind of a framework or a guideline as to why they are doing that clearly states that these partnerships are no longer in line with the commitments that they've made on climate justice. And I think that the report sets a good foundation for that. And also thinking about the role that UBC has and the responsibility that we have in training youth and preparing youth for the future. Like, what kind of jobs are going to be available for youth? That's something that has been an increasing concern for myself included as to what the future of work is going to look like if we're thinking about a warming planet. Like, what kind of jobs are going to be available? Right now we're training folks as if we've been in as if it was like still 20 years ago, but that's not the case. That's not the case anymore. So I think there's a lot of work that needs to go into that and reflecting on the trends that we're seeing. And also and honestly being honest with ourselves about the role that we have in preparing youth for the future, and what kind of majors and what kind of courses need to be taught, and the kind of skills and capacity building that's needed for a climate future. But I hope I answered that question. I went on a bit of a ramble there, but I'll stop.
That was a great answer. There was so much in there. Jess, would you like to add?
Really quickly, I'll just say, this is already in the report to do. If you look on page 38, I know I'm like nerdy, like here's this, but there's already a recommendation to do a study to find out how much we rely on it, and then to kind of make a plan. So I think just following through with what's already in the report, it provides a good foundation to move forward, and it's already there. So yeah, page 37, I'm sorry. And then I would just offer one other small thing, which is that already, like, pretty much the formal science bodies we look to, like the IPCC, and I work more on biodiversity, the International Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, which is like the sister to the IPCC. Both of these institutions and these scientists are saying, actually, to deal with these problems, we need transformational change, right? Like, we need to be thinking politically and economically and culturally. And so in many ways, it seems like really radical to be like, wow, we need to be thinking about phasing out these sectors and this kind of aspects of the educational system. But in many ways, it's in alignment with what the scientists are telling us, that we actually need to move quickly and to do that, we need to bring forward a transformational change in our economy, right? And so UBC can't be behind on that. It actually has to be at the forefront of that. And so these questions are not just simply nitpicky, like who's funding what, ooh, can't have that money. It's also like, what are we doing to build this future, right? And so I would say that's why it's so important UBC is a political actor. Not only, we don't just look at UBC, but we're thinking about this as a broader kind of change. So thank you.
Great. I think maybe it's time to bring in our next two speakers. So Michelle, I'll let you move to the introductions.
Sure. Yeah. So our third speaker today is Charles Menzies, who is a member of the Gitxaala Nation, is a professor in the Department of Anthropology at UBC and coordinator of the Ecological Anthropology Research Group, Forests and Oceans for the Future. Charles recently served as an elected member of the UBC Board of Governors and is currently an elected joint faculty senator on the UBC Vancouver Senate. Welcome, Charles.
Thank you. Hagwal-Hayats Dewayu, Gisbiwada Kikatla. Hagwal-Hayats is my Kikatla name from the house of the clan Gisbiwada, or Blackfish. You're welcome to call me Charles today. So I want to talk about the subject today by explaining a couple words and then exploring what those words mean. And then I'll bring that back to UBC. We often talk about the Lakyub in Kikatla, and there's parallel terms with that. And quite literally, it can be translated into English as on earth or on ground or on dirt. So if you think of that notion, the Lakyub refers to positioning people on the land. You may be familiar with the more edu-speak term land-based learning or land-based knowledge. So that's what that sort of refers to. And each of our communities, we have groups called WELP, or houses. And a house is interesting because it's both a physical dwelling, it's a place, but it's also a social group of connected people, and who may or may not all live in the same physical building, if you think historically. So I want these two words because with each WELP, with each house, there is a Lakyub. And then that is really important, that connection between the house, the group of people, and the place, that earth, that ground, and then the water as well that's connected to that. The authority over the Lakyub resides with the WELP, with the house. But this is the kind of authority and jurisdiction that doesn't allow for the alienation of pieces of it, or breaking it away. It's still a form conceptually of property, but it's not property in the capitalist world, which is when you use the term the alienation of property, where you can break something apart from yourself and individuals can have choice. Here is a situation where people who live within the house group live on the land and have an obligation and authority and autonomy over control of that. But they don't live by themselves because each of the WELPs are in connections with other groups, which today people might think of as you might hear our people back home talk about the nation or the wider community. So all the house groups within the Kikatla Nation had autonomous control over their particular land and water and territories, but no one group could live by itself. And in fact, if in our area, if we were to catch all the fish or cut all the trees down, it would have an effect on people beside us. So we had an obligation to those around us. And while there's this geographical placement that brings us into integration with each other, there's this social realm, because we didn't necessarily all live in the same house or territory. Some of us would be strangers or guests in other people's houses. And so there's a social web that would link us and connect us. This geographical integration and autonomy was held together by this kind of human relationship. And so my heirs, my nephews and nieces, would live in somebody else's territorial land. And so I had an obligation to pay attention to the concerns that they had. And so too did the people who they were living with had obligations to us. And that network spread across the entire countryside. So you had this kind of distributed, small scale organization of obligations and responsibility. But those obligations didn't just stop with people or with the land, but with all the social beings that inhabit our worlds. From the creatures in the sea, the creatures on the land, the creatures in the air, there are social relationships and obligations that net people together. So when people today talk about resources and extracting, that was not a language that existed within this kind of frame of the world, but rather there were reciprocal obligations between different social communities. So if we harvested innate herring or ulican or salmon, there's a responsibility to pay attention to those social bodies, those people, and your relationship was one as in kin relationships. And this has obligations because, of course, you have obligations to one's family, to one's relations that you have to pay attention to. Doesn't mean we always follow those obligations properly. Just think of household family relations in today's world where there's ups and downs and back and forwards. That's the reality of the world. But these webs of relations knit autonomous and independent house groups together in a way that created a sustainable capacity for millennia. And before somebody out there says, oh, but there wasn't that very many people, or oh, the resources were very rich, let me assure you, these may have been small communities with large populations. That the actual the number of people who lived in the North Coast and Kakatla territory is far higher than the numbers that people often have in their popular imagination. This was no barely surviving society. This was a wealthy, well-off, healthy society with lots of resources and lots of hard work and lots of effort in order to maintain that. And the capacity to destroy the environment was there. And our oral history tells times about the possibilities where people lost sense of who they were, lost their connections to the past and to the place, and then calamity befell. And right now we're moving into a period where people have forgotten who they are. They have lost the connection and the understanding of their obligations and responsibility, and a crisis is coming. Then there will be payment that will be meted out. Of course, we can try to do things to avoid that. And I think the example of my home community and other similar indigenous nations, with the importance of the Lac-U, with the being on the land, on the earth, and our obligations to it and other people and other beings, gives a kind of idea and an example of how you can have authority and jurisdiction while relying upon integration, cooperation with small communities, as I said, but large populations. Now here at UBC is really part of the problem. And it doesn't matter to me how many commissions and case studies and special groups and task forces we have about adjusting to climate change within the current structures of our economy and our social relations. UBC's problem is that it is a tightly administratively controlled network with a top-down hierarchical power structure. It's focused on constant and unmitigated continuous growth. From the buildings that we're constantly doing, I merely look out my window, and I have the pleasure of living on campus. I can look out my window here and I can see cranes on the horizon. I can see the cement being poured into foundations. I can see the plastic materials. I can see the heavy petroleum products being used to move all this concrete up in the air. This is part of the problem, but it's not just the physical structure of our campus that's creating the problem. It's the constant idea that bigger is always better. More students, more faculty, more staff, more workers, more grants, more. We're constantly promoting the growth. And even in the task force report, we have this emphasis on more excellent research, except now it's going to be sustainable research. And so there's a kind of ironic, dystopic viewpoint embedded within this entire process that we actually need to break the chain of growth. We need to start thinking about, instead of constant growth, we need to think about slow growth, or perhaps, dare I say it, no growth. It's time to move the conditions back and to bring ourselves to the future by looking backward in time to examples of successful societies that lived with a capacity to do massive harm, but learned to temper that harm through integration and distribution. And I think that is the avenue of success that we can see for going forward. But until UBC across all its dimensions decides that it is no longer constantly going to grow, like the residential communities, the constant spread, everyone is scaling up, building bigger, building taller. It's time for that to end. We need to return to a scale that's more human, where we know the people that we live with, we know the people in our immediate worlds, that we have meaningful and effective connections with these people. And that won't happen unless we make a major disjuncture in which we all take a point of, instead of building big, to build down and to move back to a better future, which is premised upon the Indigenous reality of where we are today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Charles. That was really powerful, and I look forward to discussing those points with you further in a few minutes. But for now, our next speaker is Sharon Stein, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Educational Studies at UBC. She is a founder of the Critical Internationalization Studies Network and a founding member of the Gesturing Towards Decolonial Futures Collective. Welcome, Sharon.
Thank you so much, Michelle. Thank you to the USI for inviting me, and to all of my co-presenters. It's a bit intimidating to follow you all, but I'll do my best. I'm speaking to you from Musqueam territory. I'm very grateful to be here and very cognizant of what it means for me to be here, in particular in relation to the historical and ongoing colonial violence that makes my presence on these lands possible, and the responsibilities that come with that. And that includes responsibilities in relation to climate justice, which very much informed my work with Adriana and Dr. Jan Hare and others as part of the Indigenous Engagement Working Group of the Climate Emergency Task Force. Because Adriana spoke a bit about this, I'm not going to focus on that. I'm going to offer some more general comments that nonetheless relate very closely to the complexities that were involved in the process of getting that working group established, and the still open question of how UBC will fulfill its climate-related responsibilities to local and global Indigenous communities going forward. So there's this acronym that is commonly used in the world of social innovation to describe our current context, and that is Vuca: volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And this is the world, this Vuca world is the world that our institutions are navigating and that our students are also negotiating. And it's a world that we're told universities are very interested in engaging and serving. But the question of how we should do this is still very unclear. Because in a Vuca context, the existing solutions and paradigms of change that we have proven to be quite limited in their ability to actually address our challenges. But it's very difficult to break out of these inherited patterns of change and engage the reality of the challenges we face. And these are ecological challenges, yes, but also social, political, and economic challenges. So this is really difficult to do, especially when there's no clear or simple solutions that are available. So in many cases, when we think about education, we think about content, the specific knowledge that people need to know in order to be able to succeed or intervene in responsible, relevant ways. But in this world of intensifying change, it's really hard to know in advance what content will actually be useful for students in the future. So rather than focus on content, the questions I would ask of UBC and all universities in what is currently known as Canada are things like, how can we prepare ourselves and our students to ethically and effectively engage with the challenges of this Vuca world without becoming overwhelmed or immobilized or nihilistic? How can we move beyond existing paradigms of change and the promises of naive hope for systemic continuity in order to accept the severity of the crises that we face, and to address those crises in ways that are oriented by humility, discernment, maturity, and accountability? How are we developing the intellectual, affective, and relational capacities that we would need in order to face the complexities and contradictions of the wicked social and ecological problems we face, and also face our complicity in creating those problems in the first place. So these questions suggest the need for a kind of university education that could support the development of the stamina, the capacities, and the dispositions that we would need in order to address local and global challenges. But as a scholar who researches the very contested dynamics of things like internationalization, decolonization, and sustainability in higher education contexts, I'm also very specifically interested in the question of whether and how our institutions are actively inviting and encouraging critical, reflexive, and dissenting perspectives regarding our efforts to address these challenges. And that includes the kinds of questions that many of my co-presenters have raised today. Are we actually protecting spaces where people can offer perspectives that, for instance, seek to make visible the inherent unsustainability of our current socioeconomic system, as well as the historical and ongoing colonial violence that underwrites that system? This also includes efforts to critique the role of universities themselves in producing climate change. For instance, how can we create institutional cultures where we are encouraged to honestly assess the extent to which universities are perhaps part of the solution to climate change, but also definitely part of the problem? How can we develop modes of engagement where we can ask these kinds of difficult self-implicating questions without being guided by concerns about institutional PR? And are there spaces where students can honestly engage with the full range of possible futures we might be facing, including the possibility of social and ecological breakdown? So my concern is that if we don't preserve space for these kinds of questions and conversations, that even our really well-intended sustainability efforts are going to reproduce common patterns of colonial engagement. And that includes unequal, extractive, and paternalistic relationships between dominant and marginalized communities, simplistic solutions to complex problems, and ethnocentric and specifically Eurocentric imaginaries of justice, responsibility, and change. And this can be illustrated as one example of the way that many institutions are embracing the UN sustainability goals, or the SDGs. And despite the fact that there is this growing consensus around the concerns about biophysical limits of the planet, the dominant paradigm of response to climate change is still centered on this idea that we can balance infinite economic growth with ecological sustainability. The idea being that at some point we will have more efficient technologies that can enable us to decouple this growth from environmental degradation. But beyond even the question of whether these innovations are going to come fast enough to stave off further climate catastrophe, is also this question of, well, is climate change really just a technological problem? Or are there also these ethical and political considerations that need to shape how we respond to climate change? So Indigenous scholars like Kyle White have pointed out that just because a technology is green doesn't mean that it's immune from reproducing colonial patterns of conservation that assume continued unfettered access to Indigenous lands, appropriate and commodify Indigenous knowledges, and treat other than human beings as objects and resources. One of my own Indigenous research collaborators, Minawahuni Kui, has actually argued that, for instance, carbon trading programs like the UN REDD, or reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation, are actually, they're framed as accountable responses to climate change, but in many cases, they actually further empower colonial governments to alienate Indigenous peoples from their traditional territories and livelihoods, exposing those who critique that to further state-sanctioned violence and allowing multinational corporations to continue producing carbon emissions. So in other words, many efforts that say they're about climate change mitigation or interruption actually result in the reproduction of colonial and capitalist business as usual with a nice green tint. So my question would be, can UBC meet its stated commitments to serve the global public good and to uphold Indigenous sovereignty and rights if our international and Indigenous partners and students, staff, and faculty who work alongside them are not welcome to voice concerns about the potentially negative impacts of things like the SDGs, of REDD, and many other local and global mainstream climate change initiatives? how can we build long-term relationships based in trust, respect, reciprocity, consent, and accountability if university campus members and community partners have no means to express their dissent and have that dissent heard and taken seriously when it comes to institutional decisions? So my last word is that uncritical adoption and implementation of mainstream, especially techno-solutionist responses to climate change will risk further obscuring the fact that centuries of colonial and capitalist approaches to the environment, to relationships, and to education itself have largely led us to the ecological challenges we now face. If we want to counter this risk of erasing these ongoing impacts, then institutions like UBC will need to create spaces in which these perspectives can be voiced and actually shape our policies and practices so that we can ensure that we are actually preparing students with the capacities they'll need in order to face complex challenges, address unequal power relations, navigating multiple perspectives, collaborating with diverse communities, and taking responsibility for their and our role in being part of the systemic problems that need to be addressed if we want to learn how to, or relearn how to live together on a finite planet. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, both of you. That was really, really insightful. And I think there's just so much overlap between what you were saying. I can see so many interconnections. And I think this kind of all comes down to the fact that this, Eurocentric colonial capitalist mindset is what has gotten us to this problem. And UBC as an institution is very much entangled in that mindset, that's based on economic growth and valuing like particular technical fixes as opposed to societal transformation. So I guess I'm wondering, like, given that UBC is so entangled in this, like what can be done to unentangle that, and to what extent can these changes be implemented from the top down, like from UBC administration, and if so, what would that look like? And or do we more need to be, cultivating spaces from the bottom up for community members to be engaging in these conversations and, changing our collective mindsets, if that makes sense?
That makes a lot of sense. I think one thing I might just quickly say is I wouldn't put the fault at Eurocentric. I put the fault at capitalist. And it doesn't matter to me whether the capitalist is European origins or Indigenous. Capitalism is capitalism. And I don't think red capitalism, which is sometimes called, is any better than the various types of things. And so I think that's important because that is a very polemical statement to make. And that I will have colleagues both here at Musqueam, up the coast, back home, who would strongly disagree with that statement. Then to your other question about can change come from top down, and actually, no, I don't think so. Of course, perhaps I'm a little bit more nihilistic, cynical, and reserved in the possibility of future change being worked. But I think fundamentally, the only time the top makes change is when the bottom pushes, because that's when they realize, oh, people are figuring out that our whole grasp on power is weak. So the only reason we actually had a climate change emergency plan came through was because there was a sense of fear and worry. And ultimately, some of the conservative thinkers on the board started to realize that, well, maybe if this starts to go, UBC should be on the front of the game, because we will lose least if we move out first in this capitalist marketplace. But without the push from below, without student mobilization, without a kind of wider sort of popular uprising on this issue, there would be no reason for those with power to actually relinquish any component of power. So that's the issue, is that, yes, ask your administrators to make the changes for you, but the only way you can ensure they make them is if we stand together on the grassroots level, constantly applying pressure and calling out for demands for change.
Yeah, I think my response is that we need people working in all spaces where these decisions are being made. And I think wherever one finds oneself is where one can intervene. And that requires a level of sort of discernment about what the landscape is where you are, where the conversation is at, where it could go next to deepen our questions about these very important issues, and how do you push enough to keep the conversation going, but not so far that you shut it down, which is sometimes a very fine line to ride, and very much depends on where we're working, who we are in relation to that work, our positionalities. But I don't think there's one space to do this work. It requires people working in all directions, and often people who are doing this work in unexpected ways. Maybe they can't be vocal about it or make that so visible, but the work is being done, and actually finding those people to work with and strategize with in our different contexts can be very important. And I think everyone can always ask themselves, we might have big critiques and want the systemic change. And at the same time, we can ask ourselves, what is, which is something that we ask in my research collective, the next small, most responsible thing I can do in relation to this question? And that is very much, the answer to that will very much depend on the context we find ourselves in and what is possible in those contexts. But I definitely agree with Charles that having these things being pushed, especially from students and from other communities that are not traditionally viewed as the most important by UBC, it enables other things to happen. It may not always enable the thing that the people pushing want to happen, but it definitely moves things and changes the landscape and requires the institution to respond in some way. And that is sort of a constant back and forth and negotiation that those of us in this work are always trying to adapt to and look down and see what's coming next and what might be possible.
Thank you both. Before we bring back the other two speakers, I'd just like to bring up a question or an idea that's in the audience questions relating to the tension between tackling climate or CO2 emissions. So the reductions of emissions, we're in a climate emergency, we have so many years and we need to get down, reduce our emissions, and the challenges of climate justice. So is there a tension between those two things? Can they happen at the same time? Is there a time scale difference between the two of them? If we're tackling one quickly and the other one requires relationship building, how do we engage in those two things?
Well, I mentioned in my remarks Dr. Kyle White, who is an Indigenous environmental philosopher, and he has a great, fairly brief paper where he talks about this concern, almost obsession with the ecological tipping point, this point at which we won't be able to come back from, and ice sheets will start melting, and there's sort of this exponential effects of climate change. And he says lots of our concerns are about avoiding this ecological tipping point, which then often leads to very technological solutions, but also solutions that are not particularly attentive to climate justice questions because they're prioritizing this ecological tipping point. And he says, okay, yes, this is a concern. However, the reason we got here is because we have violated our relationships with each other in relation to Indigenous people and settlers and that colonial relation, but also in between people and other than human beings. And there's no way we're going to get out of this climate crisis if we don't address that relational tipping point. However, that relational work takes time. It can't be rushed or instrumentalized toward this or that climate goal. And he says, he kind of puts it in a binary that I don't think it's that black and white, but he says, we could focus on the ecological tipping point and avoiding it. And we might be able to do that, but in the process, we would further surpass this relational tipping point and destroy our relationships to each other and to other than human beings on the planet. Or we could focus on mending this relational piece, and we would actually at that point be prepared to work together to face whatever ecological impacts we're facing from a very different space. So it's about the quality of relationships we have in order to be able to face these huge crises, as opposed to instrumentalizing relationships to then avoid this ecological tipping point.
The problem with the technological focus on things like CO2 emissions and all that as well, it's useful and helpful. Capitalism will survive that. And the point is that unless we address the fundamental contradiction in front of us, which is the inequities of the capitalist system and the way it expropriates from people, we're not going to solve anything. We'll have solutions. I mean, well, for the most of us, it will be a very terrible future in 50 years to 100 years. The point is that there will be those who've won the lottery of being from a wealthy class, having access to productive property in ways that are meaningful. Perhaps are presidents of universities or board of governors members and things like that, corporate leaders, and that will move forward. The reality is that the crisis is actually far more imminent and dangerous than people realize. And the real problem that's in front of us is that we haven't recognized or accepted our own complicity in keeping going the current situation. We have the power. When I mentioned that the changes that occurred when the student protests were going on, it was very interesting seeing how administrators who had thought that this wasn't really an issue that they could deal with in the proper time, all of a sudden started thinking, gosh, this is looking a little bit difficult. And they had many different motives and reasons for it, and a lot of discussions that happened between closed doors as well as in the public arena. But it really was a kind of nice object lesson in classic grassroots mobilization and organizing. You have to recognize that you have to push, you have to build alliances and cooperation, and they're constantly shifting and changing where they are. But the fundamental one is really that conflict between those who benefit from what's going on and those who don't. I mean, it's just like, you know, in the little areas locally, we can see a gas station coming to across from the arena on campus, a hydrogen gas station. It's a green gas station, and it's pushing out of the way and paving over a community basketball court that was created through community action. Now, that's a greenwash as far as I'm concerned. I'm going to be really straightforward and direct about that. It's a greenwash tied with a large corporate entity. We talk about the role of oil and gas, and here we have embedded right in the heart of the climate action change program, a large corporation that's making a transition to the good with hydrogen fuel cells, where what's really going on is the continuation of an exploitative set of relationships that's actually benefiting a small group of people. And yeah, it might drive down carbon emissions, but it won't fundamentally redress the primary theft of land, resources, and the theft of time from settler people in terms who are workers. I mean, just look at what's happening with the COVID pandemic right now. The implications, it's the people who are being paid the lowest, working in the lousiest working conditions, who are suffering the worst aspects of the current pandemic. Those of us who can work from home, who have relatively middle class comforts and things like that, have been able to continue along, a little more stress, but fundamentally, the reality is it's not too bad. And so that's really the issue that we're really facing. That's the fundamental crisis. And until we actually recognize that and accept that, I'm going to suggest to you right out, point blank, nothing will fundamentally change. But some of us might feel a lot better about we've made a difference. But the fundamental problem will continue. And that's what we need to do. And the belief that we can do it. And we see little examples, like you talk about making small changes, little examples that show it can be done, where you need to think a little bit bigger. Think like the right-wing entrepreneurial innovators about making change, and turn that into a progressive action of thinking about, yes, you can make change, and it will make a difference, and it will count.
Great, thank you both. Thank you for that. I think maybe Jess and Adriana are waiting in the wings and interested in joining into this conversation, so I'll invite them to come back. Super, thank you. That's I'm wondering if Jess or Adriana, you had anything to say on this one. To me, this seems like it's actually quite the nub, really, of some of this whole conversation, which is where and how do we put our efforts in crisis, and how do we decide to prioritize? So maybe we have, I would say, about 12 minutes left. So I don't want to go too long, but if you had a brief comment, Jess or Adriana, on this one before we go to a couple more questions from the audience. Go ahead, Jess.
Okay, I'll be really quick. I think this is like a really, I think Sharon kind of got to some of the nub of this, right? Which she's kind of saying, well, you know, like we need action on all scales, and we need to, like, we can't just say, well, we got to bring down the system, right? There also needs to be like ways to make people's lives better, like on a kind of regular basis. And we also have to think about change, you know, as taking place in a number of, in a longer time frame and over different scales. And one of the concepts that I always look to, because I think in part what we struggle with is like, you know, when is a change like just reform that's actually feeding the same processes and like re-entrenching these systems, the economy, it's the kind of state power as well, colonial patterns. So like, when is it doing that? And when is the change actually a part of launching us on this other pathway of transformative change, of a kind of change that that many of these institutions are actually calling for, but maybe don't have the vision about how to enact it. And so Andre Gortz, who's a socialist Marxist from like the 70s, he has this concept non-reformist versus reformist reform. And non-reformist reforms are the kinds of things he says actually we need to get behind, because these are incremental changes, right? They're doing things, they're making change, but they're not like undermining the possibility of, like, for him, he was a socialist, so he's looking for like, you know, a transformation of the very sort of basis of the economy. And so he calls those like non-reformist reforms. And then, but then he calls these reformist reforms are approaches that re-entrench the same kind of patterns in the status quo. And I think deciding or adjudicating between those is not easy. And I think it's not straightforward, but I think that's the kind of thinking that is important right now. And I think that's kind of what Sharon was getting at, that part of what we have to do at UBC is encourage our students and each other to kind of have this really critical insight into which pathway are we going on. And I'll just leave with another book that I've recently read, which is Dean Spade's work. Dean Spade is a transgender activist, a lawyer, amazing scholar, and they've got some, their book, Normal Life, is really also about this tension, right? Thinking in this case about the legalization of transgender rights and this question of what kind of changes are, you know, transformative and can lead in this direction and which re-entrench. And so I think we've got some people to think with on this question, and it's not straightforward, but it's so crucial, this work of reflecting on this. Thank you.
Yeah, I don't know how I'm going to be the last one to speak on this. It's really hard to follow up on all the brilliance that we just heard. But something that I've been thinking about a lot more, especially like I said in the very beginning of when I started to speak on the fact that like the view that I have on climate justice comes directly from being impacted by it in my communities. Like just in November, we just had 2 massive hurricanes back to back, which has never happened. And just like I have this issue within myself as well, where I have this sense of urgency to act on climate change because we're feeling it already. And then remembering as well that my communities have been impacted crisis after crisis for hundreds of years already, whether or not we're thinking about colonialism or neoliberal capitalism. So we have several crises to look at already if we're thinking about the experiences of marginalized communities. So that's something that I sit with a lot, and I don't have a short response to that, because I think that's something that I've been struggling with a lot myself. I think one thing that when it comes to thinking about like capitalism and climate change, truly we're trying to fit a square into a circle when we're thinking about wanting to have constant growth and, you know, an economy that is able to produce billionaires upon billionaires. We've seen so many more people get incredibly disgustingly rich in the middle of a crisis of the pandemic. And I think that's absolutely unacceptable, which I think pinpoints back to the fact that the capitalism is the crisis itself. And I think that's something that definitely needs to be addressed, and we cannot have that within a finite world with the resources that we have. And also one of the things that I also wanted to touch on was how greenwashing, and I think this is something that Charles Menzies brought up, is something that gets used a lot. Speaking from, again, my own experiences growing up in Central America, we see time and time again that there are corporations and wealthy people who come into Latin America, and specifically thinking about Central America here, and enact land grabs, and who steal land and resources from people because they think that they are better able to use this land, which again is an extremely colonial thinking, and use it for green initiatives, which again are supposed to be good for CO2 emissions, but are displacing thousands of people, are enacting those same colonial narratives that have caused a problem in the first place. So that's a huge issue, and that is happening constantly. And then the other thing that I just wanted to pinpoint is and I'll leave it at that, is reparations. Like, I firmly believe that we are owed reparations for the damage that has been caused, for the loss that has already been enacted, whether that be through small island nations who will most likely lose their homes, or whether it be through other communities who've already been impacted, and not even thinking about the damage that is owed and the reparations that are owed because of colonialism and because of slavery as well. So there's a lot of accountability to be taken, and a lot of damage that needs to be repaired. And I think there's a financial component to that, but also the component of relationships, which I think has been brought up multiple times. So I'll leave it there.
Just to follow up on all of those excellent points, I would love to know if any of you, if there are any like key institutional changes, kind of building on Jess's point about non-reformist reform, that you would suggest as like being able to actually enable transformative change. I'm really curious, Charles, to hear from you in particular, as somebody who's been very involved in UBC's decision-making bodies. So in terms of like any changes that could be made around decision-making structures that would thus enable different priorities to be, put forth.
Well, one thing I asked for when I was on the board, that they actually cost all the carbon and ecological implications of every building project, not just lauding how green or LEED it was or whatever those terms are. They've now gone up to platinum. They've been advancing so far that we're no longer just sort of silver and gold. We're up to platinum. I can't wait till they become titanium and maybe even uranium levels. Oh, pardon me, they probably wouldn't do it an uranium LEED level. That's right. Yeah, we're costing it out and actually putting a whole explanation of what is the actual ecological footprint from the design process, the fundraising process, that they did accommodate a little bit. So there's a kind of little green mention now embedded in each building plan that goes to the board. But that's the rub though. Every time you provide an opportunity for them to make an adjustment in the process and the procedure, they will concede a little bit, but in a way that doesn't actually relinquish the fundamental power or control. We're still pouring concrete. We're still putting in smelted aluminum construction into these sites and things like that. So yeah, it's better than it could have been, but that's one kind of way when you focus on those procedural things, because that's where it takes work and effort administratively. So because realistically, we're talking about creating inefficiencies in the system, because capitalism works at trying to find efficiencies, and the way you slow it down is you engineer inefficiency. Natural resource management is all about that fundamentally, but they call it in fancier things like maximum, what is it? Sustainable yield, so optimal sustainable yield becomes the phraseology, but it's engineered inefficiency. And that's what we need to do. We need to build in more of those. And that's.
Sorry, thank you. Yeah, I'm just finding my mute button in the midst. I'm listening and not, so I'm seeing that we're really coming to the end here. Maybe I'm just going to ask very quickly if people could identify some of the successes that they see UBC. There was a question here looking for concrete examples of positive things that UBC has done. So maybe we can end with that as we go around in the last minute or two. Let's start with, I'm going to start here with Sharon and go to Jess and go to Adriana and then go to Charles.
So I think I'll go back to the Indigenous Engagement Working Group of the Climate Emergency Plan, which wasn't something that it was certainly not a top-down initiative. it was made possible first through the students pushing for the climate emergency in the first place, and then through staff, students also pushing for this question of accountability to Indigenous communities. And so I'm not sure I would consider it a success per se, but I think I'm less interested in focusing on successes and actually very interested in focusing on failures. Because we spend so much time looking for like this great case study of what we did and celebratory narratives that they want to put in the weekly updates about UBC, but we don't spend nearly enough time thinking about both failed efforts, but also the things that we have done as an institution or as individuals that are extremely harmful and that require redress and regeneration of relationships. So I would like us to focus actually less solely on successes and also on failures and accountabilities in terms of what's happening now and what has happened in the history of our institution.
I think I'm next. Yeah, Sharon, I think you probably also get that tell me something good in all of your classes, and you're like, of course, there's really important like successes to pay attention to, but I agree that there's a kind of fetishization of like, you know, the solution that goes on. And so for me, one of the things I would just say is that when I was rereading the climate emergency report last night, I felt like pretty proud. I mean, it certainly had shortcomings. There were serious issues in procedure as well around BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities on campus. So it certainly was not perfect. But one of the things I think that's been going on in climate change has been a bit of a discursive struggle over whether climate change is about emissions or climate change is a much broader issue that needs to take into account political, economic, and cultural forms, this historical accountability, responsibility, these foundational assumptions and patterns. And so I think this report actually sides on the climate justice side analytic. And so for me, I think it's a real success. It's a real sign that we're finally busting out of this real narrow view of climate change as an emissions problem only. And so to me, I think that's the university should actually be lauded, and even the initial declaration of a climate emergency as a statement itself really signaled this analytical frame that I think is so crucial to really dealing with climate and a host of other crises that we face right now.
I guess I can go next. I was actually also going to point to the Indigenous Engagement Working Group as a right step. Obviously, there were a lot of flaws and it was not perfect, but when I was speaking, I was also saying that we need to have a standing group that also has access to power and decision making, as opposed to having a group that is there for the sake of just being there. I think there really needs to be a conversation around power structures, but that has also been talked about. And I think one of the things that I do want to say is that I think we are on the right path in terms of beginning, at least, to address the more systemic issues. Like from my perspective, at least, like I've been organizing within UBC for the last like 6 years at this point, and I think that in my experience in the last 6 years, we're finally getting at the point of the conversation where we're able to have these hard conversations and to talk about things at a systemic level and to be able to connect climate change to white supremacy and colonialism, which is not something that I think we were able to do even 2 years ago. So I think that in and of itself is showing me that we're in the right path. We're quite far from where we need to be. But again, if we're talking about the process of building relationships and of rebuilding and you know, changing the dynamics that we have in the systems that we're operating in, that's going to take a lot of time. But I do think we're stepping in the right direction, I want to say.
Well, I think, and when I think in terms of success, I think to my graduate students and some of the work that they've been doing. And one in particular, a woman called Celia Bauer, who took a group of Indigenous knowledge holders and a group of settler learners and brought them together to talk about the experience of living in the Lower Mainland. And through that process, had people see and understand where they were located and apply this because the participants, the non-Indigenous participants were school teachers. And so actually applying that directly. So it's kind of transformative learning through the practice. That to me is a success because it actually leads to real change in a fundamental way. I'm less interested in trying to change the machinations of the Board of Governors at UBC, because when I get to control, I will erase the entire political structure. That's only half joking, but I think when we take a look at the work, and also the climate change artist who worked with me and did a graduate program degree in resource management, these are successes because they actually show us pathways forward that actually can make a difference.
Thank you all. So we're right at time. I'd like to thank you all for taking the time to be here with us today. I'd like to thank Michelle, who's gone beyond in holding UBC to task, but has also helped formulate recommendations on how UBC should respond to the climate emergency. So thank you, and the students who have worked with you. I'd also like to thank our technical team behind the scenes, John, Tim, and USI Communications, for all of their support making this happen. And for you as an audience for joining us today and being willing to engage in this conversation with us. If you're interested in more events or want to know more about what's happening at the UBC climate emergency response, you can go to sustain.ubc.ca/events. And there you will find recordings of the first 2 climate justice webinars that were hosted by the UBC Sustainability Initiative, as well as upcoming events. So thank you all for being here with us today, and we look forward to meeting with you all again soon.